Moving on to slide number 2. My name is Bill Botten. I currently serve as the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the Access Board, and I've provided my email address at the bottom of this slide. Moving on to slide number 3. Today's agenda for the webinar is we're going to talk about the coverage. We're going to talk about 3 reference standards, what happens to existing play areas when you alter, clarifying the terms and application of the standards. We're going to talk about ground level scoping requirements, elevated play component scoping requirements, the technical provisions. We couldn't get out of this topic without talking about playground surfaces. And we'll end with soft contained play structures and also what we call water play components. The Access Board finished its work in 2002. We published the first play area requirements. And then in 2004, they came out with the Access Board's updated guidelines for the ADA and also the Architectural Barriers Act. And so in 2004, minimum requirements were out there for play areas. The Department of Justice undertook their rulemaking. They came out with the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. And their implementation date was March 15th of 2012 for all new construction and alterations. So existing play areas we'll talk about, but any new construction or alterations after March 15th of 2012 should be using the requirements that we're going to talk about today. What's covered and what's not is slide number 5. State and local governments covered by Title II, their schools, municipal parks, their recreation departments, a state park, if they had a play area, places of public accommodation covered under Title III, a privately run daycare center, a private school. And we see in a lot of, well, not in a lot, but in some Title III facilities where they'll have a play area or a soft-contained play structure as part of a restaurant or a cafeteria or dining area. And we even see them in shopping malls, things like that. So places of public accommodations that are covered under Title III often do or can have play areas as well that are covered. Those that are not are child care centers that are actually run by religious entities, such as a church or run daycare by a religious organization that includes religious instruction. There's also exceptions for homeowners associations, private residential, from not complying with these minimum requirements. As you'll hear throughout this presentation, I strongly encourage integration and the use of these requirements, even if you're not specifically required to. It's an integration issue, and why I said early on that I believe this is one of the most important parts of, or one of the best parts of the 2010 requirements and also those for the Architectural Barriers Act is it's that where inclusion begins for young people with disabilities to be able to participate on their school or in their municipal parks and playgrounds or in recreation facilities in these really unique but so neat of inclusiveness for everybody to be able to participate. So moving on to slide number 6, talks about safe harbor. Remember, there's a requirement that says that if you complied within 91 standards, you don't need to upgrade any of those specific elements, places, or spaces or facilities. Americans with Disabilities Act and the Uniform Federal Accessibilities Act, which preceded the Architectural Barriers Act, there wasn't specific requirements for play areas. So there's no safe harbor for existing facilities in play areas because there wasn't an earlier requirement in the earlier standard. Okay. More information again could be got on this information about safe harbor with the Department of Justice. And again, their phone numbers provided here on the bottom of slide number 7. So what about an existing facility? a current existing play area. Under Title II, you have the requirements for program access. And under Title III, places of public accommodation and commercial facilities, readily achievable barrier removal, which both are defined by the enforcing agency, the Department of Justice. And again, here I provide their technical assistance information line. I believe it's open from 10 to 5 Eastern Standard Time. There are a couple of days, I believe, where there may not be an afternoon or morning, but typically it's 10 to 5 Eastern Standard Time, I believe. The Architectural Barriers Act applies to buildings and facilities constructed or altered or leased on behalf of the federal government, constructed with federal financial assistance allocated for that specific construction of a play area. Employee daycare centers, we see them also play areas maybe in a federal park and other federal leased facilities. The play area accessibility requirements for many of the facilities that I was just talking about were established through the General Services Administration and became enforceable May 8th of 2006. So any new construction or alteration of a play area after that date should have met on federal land these requirements. The standard also starts with, or the specific requirements for play areas start with a few exceptions. And one are play areas that are designed for children under 2 years of age are not specifically addressed in the standard. And also those childcare facilities where the proprietor actually lives in the facility. So a home run daycare facility. And also the standard states that amusement attractions are not considered play components. I'm going to jump right in on slide number 11 with the reference standards. Remember, both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act reference the same reference standards. And in reference standards for play areas, we reference 3 different standards that are set by a voluntary standard organization called the American Standard Testing Materials, or now ASTM International, standards worldwide. We reference these 3 standards that specifically address the play area surface and how to define certain portions of the surface. So the first one, identified by its call ASTM F1487, and the Access Board references the 2001 version, the Standard Consumer Safety Performance Specification for Playground Equipment for Public Use. We referenced that earlier version, and I'll talk more about what it specifically addresses. We also reference ASTM F1292, and we reference the 99 or the 04 version of these requirements. And that's the standard specification for impact attenuation of surface materials within what we call the use zone of a playground equipment. And finally, we have a wheelchair work requirement, which defines the maneuverability of playground surfaces. So we meet the use zone requirements, we meet the fall attenuating or impact attenuation requirements, and we meet the wheelchair maneuverability requirements with ASTM F1951-99, standard specification for the determination of accessibility of surface systems under and around playground equipment. Now there's been a move. I mean, we're already in 2021, and we're still referencing versions from 1999. The reason for that is there were specific issues in those that we wanted to reference. You can use a later or more recently published version of these editions of these reference standards under equivalent facilitation, which would mean that it provides equal or greater accessibility in the newer version, and that it meets all the minimum requirements of the version specified. So let's move in here on slide number 13 about ASTM F1487, the 2001 version, which defines the use zone as the ground area beneath the immediate or adjacent to a play structure of play equipment. And in this slide here, 13, I'm showing you an overhead climber. That's a ground level play component, and it's identifying this use zone in which provides unrestricted circulation around the equipment on whose surface where it is predicted that a user would land when falling from or exiting this play equipment. So based on how high it gets, this use zone may get larger around the piece of equipment. That's identified in ASTM 1487. It's only one of the features identified by that reference standard, but the most important one we're talking about today. So once I've identified that use zone, I need to make sure that that area where a child could fall from this playground equipment or be exiting from this equipment meets the fall attenuation or impact attenuating requirements. And in order to do that, that's done with this device that you see here on slide 14 by dropping it at the distance from the height of the elements in which are in this play area. And then no value shall exceed the values that you see stated here. Not greater than 200 G max and not greater than a 1,000 head impact. So those two values need to be met in that area. So the standard requires the surface to meet those impact attenuating requirements. It also requires, as I stated, to meet the wheelchair maneuverability requirements. Here on slide 15, I'm showing you that the baseline used for a wheelchair work method is a 7% ramp. And in the bottom picture, you can see an individual pushing up a manual wheelchair up a 7% grade for a distance about 6.5 feet, where they measure the amount of workforce required to propel up that distance. Okay, so that's your baseline. You also have a curve test or a turn test. You can see that in the upper picture here where a person pushes the wheelchair around a 90-degree turn in that same surface on the flat to determine whether or not this installed test bed meets those requirements or is under the threshold of that 7% grade. So once you determine the baseline, you do a straight test on the playground surface installed in a test bed, and you also do it a 90-degree turn. And the values have to be less than those required when we're doing this push up a 7% grade. Okay, that establishes the type of surface material that meets the ASTM F1951. Moving on to alterations. So I have an existing play area and I'm always trying to determine, am I doing maintenance or am I doing an alteration? I'm on slide 17 and it's showing a picture of maybe the swing has an S hook that's been worn out now, so we need to replace it. Or maybe the surface has been displaced where children are coming in and out of a certain piece of playground equipment and it needs to be raked into place. Both of these would be considered maintenance because you're just returning the characteristics that were already there, okay? An alteration, and it's important to read the alteration definition from the standards. I think a lot can be gained from just reading that definition, but it's actions that affect or could affect the usability of the play area or in the space or the element, whatever we're talking about. So examples could be removing a certain type of play component and putting in a different type. Okay, we're changing the usability, or maybe you're changing the ground surfacing from one type of material to another. Those would be considered alterations. What happens when I alter a primary function area? Okay, we have an additional obligation for path of travel to that altered primary function area, the 20% disproportionality rule. Okay, so the idea here is that based on that cost, we'd be looking at what that alteration cost was, and a portion of that alteration cost then needs to be spent to the site arrival point or getting people to that newly altered play area. I wanted to clarify some of the terms and application of a play area standards. Moving on to slide number 21, a play area contains play components and it's designed and constructed for children. I think this picture that I'm showing here on slide 21 really kind of shows a lot of the characteristics that we're going to talk about throughout this presentation. We can see that they're mixing different types of surface material. I guess you can imagine which ones of the surface materials are they're considering accessible. Remember, not all play components have to be on an accessible route. So what they're doing in this slide here is that in this photo, we're actually connecting those entry and exit points of accessible play components. We also can see that there's a border route all the way around this play area, a connecting route, probably comes from the site arrival, maybe from different areas throughout your park or from a parking lot. And then you can see that there's other site amenities that are provided around this surface. But we'll be talking about many of these different characteristics, including the ramps, the transfer systems, and what is considered play components at ground level and elevated. As I shared with you in that earlier slide, I'm on to slide number 22. There are requirements for that route, whether you're inside the play area or outside the play area. Remember, all elements, spaces, and facilities on the same site need to be connected by at least one accessible route. So if this was outside the play area, we'd be looking at not providing a slope greater than 5% or 1 in 20. If we went over that, have to do it as we'd have to consider it a ramp and have to provide handrails. Okay. All the requirements for accessible routes would have to be met here outside the play area. And then when we get inside the play area, we modify some of the accessible route requirements that we'll talk about throughout this presentation. The standards apply to a play area, not an area of sport activity. Okay, remember, an area of sport activity is a portion of a room or space where play or practice of a sport occurs. And I'm showing you on slide 23 a series of ball fields. Okay, play areas and areas of sport activities are looked at in the standard as two separate different types of issues. If you're geographically separating play areas, maybe you have a school and you have one play area on one side, one on another, each play area would be considered independent and be looked at independently when evaluating per the requirements that I'm going to be sharing with you. Also, if you're separating play areas by age, maybe you have a young age playground and you have an older teenage area for play as a playground. If you're separating by age, we'd also look at each one of those separate areas as needing to meet these minimum requirements separately and then be connected by an accessible route because they'd be on the same site. What is a play component? A play component is that element designed to generate a specific opportunity for play or socialization or learning. We get questions about whether a bench or a seat in a play area is considered a play component. It's questionable, but remember, what we're trying to stimulate here is integration and opportunities for young people to do this, play, interact, and learn. I can't say that a bench or a seat inside the play area could never be considered a play component, but I would challenge that what we're really after is to encourage as much play or activity as possible as well. And so it may be appropriate in some situations, but maybe not in others. And also learning, we see a lot of adaptive panels where it tries to teach you a specific function or an idea. Those are good, but we want to make sure that that's not the full focus of some play areas, that they provide different opportunities for a wide range of users. Let's move on to slide number 26, and I see this more and more frequently now, is natural play features, or natural features being used as play components, and they would be considered a play component, right? We're putting them in, as you can see throughout these photos here on slide 26, several different things, whether they're all at ground level or whether they're elevated. If mounds or hills are being created to put several play components on that mound or hill, it should be treated as a composite play structure and looked at then what level of access would need to be required. If it was just a mound, I would think that it would be ground level and you get an access route to it, right? I think providing greater access to mounds can be achieved by providing a transfer platform on one side. I'm a person that uses a manual wheelchair. Scooting is easier than going up transfer steps. Scooting backwards up a mound, I feel, is easier than scooting up steps, for me anyway, as I get older. But I just think it's easier for kids too. But if you're providing that mound instead of transfer steps, I think it's still important to think about how someone would transfer from a mobility device. And it's harder to get from the ground than it is all the way at the ground surface than it would be to at a level that's equal to an entry point or a seat, the requirements that I'm going to show you pretty soon here, so that you're elevated some and have a flat surface that then from there you could scoot on up, make it easier and more independently usable. So lots of things up on a mound, composite play structure. Individual things on, like we're seeing throughout these photos, look at how some of the entry point and seat requirements might apply to if you're getting on a stone, getting on a log. If you could provide them within some of those ranges so that somebody from a mobility device has an easier opportunity to try transfer to some of these and still try utilize them in some form. Okay, that would be my advice in these type of areas. So what's not a play component? Well, we say the transfer system, the steps, we even say the ramp, the decks, the roofs. I know you find your kids on those. Okay, they run up and down the steps and the transfer systems, and my kids used to be up on the roof, but it's not considered a play component per the standard. Ground level play components. I'm on slide number 28 if you're keeping up, and it shows several different pictures of ground level play components, and those are approached and exited at ground level. So they're typically independent of other things. They might be attached like a series of swings, but each swing is independent. It's approached and exited at ground level. Moving on to slide number 29 is elevated play components, and they're approached from an elevated level. They're attached to a composite play structure. Okay, that's where we had that mound with several things on it. It's a composite play structure. Now they're considered elevated up there. And components are only counted once. You're either elevated or you're ground level. Okay, so in the picture that I'm showing, I have a young person that's going up a series of blocks, a climber. That climber, since it's attached and can be approached from an elevated level, it's part of a composite play structure, would only be counted as an elevated play component. On slide number 30, I have this slide that kind of shows you one or the other and gives you an opportunity to kind of see that, the one on the left, you approach and exit it, right? And get on it and off it right there from the ground. The one on the right is a climber, a ring climber that goes up to a transfer platform. It's part of a composite play structure. Only counted once, only counted as elevated. I say this and help you understand these two differences, because if you're going to go out and evaluate a play area, one of the first things you have to understand is, okay, how many elevated play components, how many ground level play components are there here? Remember, I have to have an accessible route to the transfer system for elevated play components or the ramp, and then I have to have an accessible route to clear floor space at my ground level play components. I'll get into the scoping requirements here coming up, but I need to understand the differences so that I can start my worksheet, kind of understand how many elevated, how many ground level, or if you're trying to bid on a project where you're trying to determine if my project's accessible, we need to know how many they're considering elevated and what are they. We need to know what's ground level and what are they, okay, and how they're going to be placed and how that impacts the surface material or my accessible routes throughout the play area. At ground level, the scoping provisions, slide 31, I'm moving straight into 32. It's one of each type. Okay, it's one of each type. If you have a swing bay, it could be just one swing. In the bottom right-hand picture, there's sand diggers. It could just be one. In these, you're seeing where they're incorporating greater access, where they're doing two. I always encourage to do greater than the minimums, right? It's always better to support greater access if possible. And in this case, it might just be a little bit different or a little bit more surface material, but try integrate those two into the whole aspect of your play area and incorporate, integration and accessibility. So here it is. If there's more than one, integrated into the play area to make sure everybody's got an opportunity. I like this picture on the left. That's why I included it in here. It shows a hard surface where coming to this area that's sand, and it gives an opportunity for a person with a mobility device. Doesn't have one with a seat, but has one where you can pull up from a mobility device and actually still do the sand digger from the hard surface and not even have to get into the sand. Play tables, again, are some of those features that permit access from an elevated level for somebody that may not be able to leave a mobility device, but still interact with those young kids around them in the same opportunity. Now there's another scoping provision that I need to tell you about, and that is that based on how many elevated play components you have, you may have an additional obligation for some to be provided at ground level and some additional types. Now, we've not talked a lot about that yet, but remember I said at ground level, it's one of each type. And the Access Board in the minimum requirements and through the Department of Justice's 2010 standard doesn't define those types. But in our technical assistance material, we talk about the basic functions of what you're doing. Are you swinging? Are you sliding? Are you turning? Are you digging? What are you doing? That's the play component, because that's kind of the type of play component, because sliding down a corkscrew enclosed slide or going down a straight open slide is still sliding. It's still a play component of that same type. So again, based on the number of elevated play components provided, there may be an additional obligation for more ground level. And the idea here was that maybe not all young people are able to transfer from their mobility device, and that if there's a whole bunch of stuff on an elevated level, could be 19, with only a transfer system, then then the opportunities in the play area are very limited. So the idea was to try to increase more ground level and different types for greater opportunities for young people that could not leave their mobility device typically. And so you can see here in this graphic here, we have the number of elevated play components. This is another reason why you need to understand whether and how many elevated play components you have. But if we just move down to, I have say 11 elevated play components, 11 to 13, it says that the minimum number of ground level play components required on an accessible route is 4. And then it says of those 4, the minimum number of different types need to be 3. So I could have 2 of the swings be the accessible component and then a couple others. You can see how that could increase the number of ground level play components and how many of the types of ground level play components you have based on the number of elevated play components provided. Moving on to 35 is just a session description title slides as technical provisions. We're going to move straight into 36. There is a protruding object requirement that says an 80-inch vertical clearance is required at ground level accessible routes, clear floor spaces, and maneuvering spaces. So getting to your ground level accessible play component, you need to provide a minimum 80-inch vertical head clearance. Moving on to slide 37, it talks about that ground level accessible route requirements. And here's 8 different topics that are addressed. The surface, the clear width reductions. We have a change in level requirement, running slope, cross slope, openings, and as I just shared with you, protruding objects. Moving on to slide number 38, it talks about that minimum clear width. In the built environment, what's the minimum clear width of an accessible route? 36 inches. In a play area, we bring it out to 60. Okay, the idea here is so that individuals can turn, maneuver, because there's no expectation that if you get off your accessible surface, you can move or you may be trapped. Okay, there could be a change in level. We don't want to see a change in level there, but it could be between those 2 different surface materials. So the idea here is that somebody could turn and chase someone else or decide to go somewhere else, all in their same route. So a minimum of 60 inches. If you have a small play area, I'm moving on to slide 39. If you have a small play area, which we say is less than 1,000 square feet, you can have an accessible route that's only 44 inches as long as you never exceed 30 feet without providing some way to turn around, either 2 cross connecting routes creating a T or a 5-foot turning circle. We also permit that reduction of your 60-inch minimum route down to 36 inches for a distance of 5 feet. From 5 feet down to 3 feet for a distance of 5 feet. To get around a tree, get around another play component, things like that, the idea is that it's similar to the door reduction requirements or permissions, exceptions that get you through a door. You know, when you're going down an accessible route, you're going 36, it permits you to go down to 32 for a distance of 24, separated by 48. This is just for a distance of 5 feet. It doesn't specifically address, I don't believe, the distance between those 5-foot intervals. Running slope maximum is a 1 in 16 slope. So remember, we were testing ground surfaces at a 7% grade, but in addition to that, you could make your running slope out in the play area. As I've highlighted here, for every 16 feet of run, you could come up a foot, or for every 16 inches of run, you could come up an inch. I'm sorry, every 16 inches, you could come up an inch. So that's the max running slope. On your ground level accessible route, remember that 60-inch requirement to those ground level or entry point or exit points of elevated play composite structures. Also a cross slope requirement on slide 42, 1 in 48, no steeper than, is the requirements within that 60-inch accessible route. Slide number 43 talks about openings, and it's similar to what we find along any accessible route, and that is a 1/2 inch opening, okay, a 1/2 inch diameter. If it's elongated, you want to place that elongated opening perpendicular to the dominant direction of travel, just as we do in walking surfaces currently. Where I see these openings is similar to what we're seeing here, where you have several slabs of concrete that are trying to abut, or you're mixing different surfaces, or you have some type of a grading for drainage. Those would be it, or maybe a tree grate, things like that along your routes. Change in level requirement, is that same as an accessible route? You find along walking surfaces, you can have a 1/4 inch abrupt, or you can do a 1/2 inch if it's beveled 1 to 2. So when you're in this picture on the far left, you see on the lower left, I should say, that change in level when you're sloping into a play area, as I'm showing here, you want to make sure that that transition migrates so that you're not greater than that 1/4 inch abrupt. That's really challenging with the surface materials that are loose fill like this, that 1/4 inch abrupt, to meet those minimum requirements. It's so important to compact those loose fill products as hard as you can to make sure that they do stay compliant. Also, where you have, the changes in surface, maybe you're coming onto a rubber safety tile or something like that. Make sure that that change in level along the accessible routes. Remember, outside the accessible routes, these requirements don't apply. It's only that 60-inch accessible route requirement to connecting those ground level and elevated play components. As I showed you earlier on, remember when we were looking at that aerial view of the play area where we're looking at all the different surfaces that were in that play surface and where they were using the what for accessible routes? Um, Moving on to another issue that's always brought up is, do we need to meet the minimum requirements for carpet? The requirement would be yes, as long as it's in the 60-inch accessible route. It would be same as a walking surface and any other surface specified in the built environment. You'd need to meet the 1/2 inch measured to the backing or cushion or a pad. I already told you about the 80-inch minimum requirement that applies along that 60-inch ground level accessible route. Not required for the entire play area, but you would need to meet the 80-inch vertical clearance along those accessible routes. In this one, I'm showing kind of a roadway system that maybe surrounds the play area for individuals to learn to ride something. And a lot of these are really cool too for persons using mobility devices. I've seen some great concepts put in to where there's these concrete rollers where kids that are skateboarding and riding the bikes or learning anything for the first time, including young people with chairs or mobility devices, could go up and down those different types of surface materials or across different bumps or things like that. I thought it was very unique, and I think the more you can teach a young person to use their mobility device independently over lots of different obstacles and ideas, it incorporates greater fun and activity for all people to come to your play area. Here we go, ground surfaces. I'm on to slide number 47's title slide. Let's move straight in to say that the Access Board studied ground surfaces and playground surfaces for about 20 years. As long as I've been at the Access Board, I've been part of a playground surface study, or the Access Board has been looking at playground surfaces. And we hooked up with the National Center on Accessibility and did a longitudinal assessment of different types of play surfaces. And that research is summarized and available on the Access Board's homepage. If you go to research and completed research, you can find that research project, but also in our technical assistance material from that research study was produced this guide, 7 things every playground owner should know about the accessibility of their playground surface. I get questions daily about playground surfacing, and it's a really challenging one, I understand, because remember, we were trying to make sure it's soft enough for young people not to get hurt when they fall off equipment, and um, hard enough, basically, or firm and stable enough for persons using a mobility device to have access to a percentage of the playground equipment. And sometimes those two intersect, right? The use zone is going to intersect with where wheelchair accessibility also needs. And I think what I've learned over my years is that there's not an ideal surface all the time. You really have to look into your type of play area, the population that you're trying to serve, how many people are going to be using that play area surface daily. Can I maintain that type of activity over a prolonged period of time? How long is my surface good for? Make sure you have some form of warranty or understanding. How frequently are we going to test it to make sure I'm in compliance? Um, who's in charge of the maintenance over what period of time? I think that if you have a playground where you have hundreds of kids on the same play area multiple times a day, I think that a loose fill product may be very challenging to maintain the accessibility of it, of the accessible routes. And that's where we saw that loose fill and turf surface being used in that earlier overhead view to reduce the maintenance, because remember, the requirements that we're talking about here are only for that 60-inch accessible route. Now, I shared with you that I'm a person that uses a manual chair, and when I had young children, I found it very difficult because when there was a change in surface material, my kids knew exactly how far my arm could reach them in the sand area. Um, and when it was time to go home, that could be very challenging, right? About the ability to get everybody to get back to the car. But I think the other thing that I learned very quickly there is that young people understand that so quickly that even when they're playing with a young person in a mobility device, they understand where they can't go anymore, and where that route ends. And so I really encourage for a really integrated and accessible as possible would mean that we wouldn't integrate too many surfaces that were not accessible and didn't provide at least the minimum requirements that we talked about earlier, to make sure that you could travel anywhere in the play area if somebody was chasing you and still be a part of the fun. So if you're someone that's doing the bidding, or you're over your play areas in your community or at your facilities, make sure you understand these. Reach out to the Access Board. We're always willing to provide more information to you, and the manufacturers of these can provide you with a lot of information. But I would say that at the minimum, you'd want to make sure that you met those minimum reference standards and had certificates that show that you could meet those minimum standards, and make sure that those are done, fairly soon, so that you're getting the same kind of test on the same kind of material you get or are using. But that it's so important to be able to understand what you do have in your play area. And my next slide, moving on to slide number 50, shows the two different field tests. On the left-hand side, the triax, which is used to determine that fall attenuation or impact attenuation requirements that we spoke about in ASTM F1292 and the versions we reference. And then on the right-hand side, the field test device is now called an instrumented surface indenter, not a rotational penetrometer, but most of you probably still remember it as a rotational penetrometer. The Access Board believes greatly in these devices being able to predict and quantify the values that should be used to determine accessibility. We've worked with ASTM now for 20 years to try to implement the field test for ASTM F1951 unsuccessfully. I do believe it correlates the lab tests very closely through all the information that I've read and been a part of any of the correlation testing, but it's still not there. But I would still encourage you that if you have a loose fill product that you want your material tested upon installation and periodically through the life of your product, understand how long your product lasts. The triax is an important tool to make sure that you're doing the best job to make sure nobody's getting hurt, and staying up with those values and making sure that you at least meet or exceed the minimum requirements is so very important. I have to move on to slide 51. It talks about elevated plate component requirements. And so at ground level, remember, it was one of each type. At elevated, it's at least 50% of the elevated plate components must be on an accessible route. The scoping requirements, or is that 50%, triggers the type of accessible route permitted based on the number of elevated plate components. So less than 20, you could do a ramp, but you could do all of it as 50% of the elevated plate components connected by a transfer system. It's a rare accessible route that you can use transfer steps and transfer systems. It's only in recreation in a few areas that we permit something like this. It can be very challenging. I'll be talking more about transfer systems coming up. If you had 20 or more elevated plate components, you still have to meet the 50% required to be accessible, right? So of that, you can ramp, or you are required to ramp 25% when you have 20 or more, and the other 25% could be either ramp or transfer. So just to take that an example, if I had 20 elevated plate components, I had to make 50% of those accessible. That means 10 of them. Of that, I have to ramp 5. I could ramp the other 5 for all 50%, or I could do transfer system to the other 5. So of the 20, 10 are accessible. Okay, half of that 10 is the ramp requirement. The other half of that 10 is either ramp or transfer. I think ramp access provides greater opportunities in a lot of cases than transfer. And if you went ahead and ramped 50% of your elevated play components, there's no requirement to go back to that earlier chart that I showed you based on the number of elevated play components I have. I may have additional obligations at ground level or even additional types at ground level. So if I ramp or if you ramp in your play area 50% of your elevated play components, you do not have to return back to that scoping chart because the expectation here is, right, children that are unable to leave their mobility devices can reach 50% of the elevated play components from their mobility device. Great opportunity doing that. And this play area is just an overhead view showing one with different types of ramping systems. That elevated accessible route, I'm on slide 54. That elevated accessible route, 36-inch minimum clear width, you really need to exceed wherever possible. The picture I'm showing you here is a 5-foot one elevated, so that 2 people can pass. Okay, exceed where possible. Some restrictions or reductions, I should say, that down to 32 are permitted. Openings. If you have a transfer system, you have an opening requirement. I'm sorry, if you have wheelchair access, you have an openings requirement. If you don't have wheelchair access, you don't have an openings requirement. So this is only along those areas. Criteria applies to the elevated access is accessed by a ramp, not by transfer. So if you had a grading system, you wouldn't want to have an opening of 1 inch. Okay, remember it's a 1/2 inch diameter only. So watch what you have as an opening where you're providing ramp access to elevated plate components. Remember, if they're elongated openings, they need to be perpendicular to the dominant direction of travel. And that's done for loose surfaces to get down below or whatever they're using it for. But watch what you're using as grading if wheelchair access is provided. The maximum running slope is 1 in 12, similar to the built environment. For every 1 foot you go up, you run out 12, or every inch you go up, you run out 12 inches. The ramp rise is limited though in a play area. I'm on slide 57. The maximum vertical rise is only 12 inches. Remember, in the built environment, it's 30 inches. I can go 30 inches of vertical rise or have a 30-foot ramp before I have to have a level landing. In the play area, you can go 12 inches. I'm showing you design in this photo here on 57 where they actually berm up higher so they can get to a higher elevation so that 12-inch vertical rise is still there, but you've started from a higher point. But you have to limit the vertical change in level on your ramps to no greater than 12 inches of vertical rise, then have a level landing, then you can go again. You do have to have handrails. They need to be continuous. Here's tells you about the specifications for the gripping surface. There's never extensions required in handrail ramp extensions. I'm moving on to slide number 59, showing you the minimum is 20 inches, max is 28 inches above the ramp surface. You can still have the upper one if you want to. It doesn't say you can't, but you want to provide a lower handrail for young people to be able to use those handrails at a height that they can use. Edge protection, wherever you have handrails, remember there's 2 different ways to do it. You can do a curb or barrier within 4 inches of the ramp surface, or you can extend the ramp surface 12 inches. I'm moving on to slide 61 that talks about the landings on an elevated accessible route. It's similar to what you find in the built environment. Remember, if you go up the landing and you keep going straight ahead in the direction of the ramp, it's just a 60-inch minimum length. Okay, so you're flat for 60 inches, and then you keep going up the width of your ramp. Where the ramp changes direction, remember it's 5 feet by 5 feet or 60 by 60 to give somebody the maneuvering space in a mobility device to turn that corner. So anytime a landing, you're 5 foot by 5 foot. The turning space, the landings, and clear floor space, ground spaces all can overlap. Here you're seeing a child on slide 62 that's at a steering wheel, an adaptive, something you could play with, a panel or something on a ramp landing, and the clear space for that elevated play component, okay, the landing, the turning space required there, that 5 by 5 space, all may overlap one space. So let's get into the transfer system. It includes a transfer platform, transfer steps, transfer supports, and a clear floor of ground space at that transfer platform. I'm on slide 63, and it's showing a couple of different things about this transfer system. We define the size. We don't tell you it has to be plastic, wood, or metal. Um, we tell you what the minimum sizes are. They could be in the shape of a turtle, a triangle, a rectangle, or whatever, as long as you meet those minimum space requirements. So remember we talked about earlier the scoping requirements for elevated play components less than 20. So there's a whole lot of 19 elevated play component units around this country. So less than 20 elevated play components, you can just get a transfer system, right? There's no ramp access required. You still can ramp, but the standard only gives you ramp access, remember, if you're 20 or greater. So you may use a transfer system instead of ramps to connect the 50% required components. Moving on to slide 65, transfer systems. It consists of that platform and transfer step. The idea here is you're leaving your mobility device and you're bumping, crawling, scooting something up those stairs. Now listen, if it's a really hot day, that brown metal gets really hot. So you might have to consider something shading for your play area. Consider the user group that's using your play area. How many people are going to be doing this? Imagine scooting like the child in the upper right-hand picture, and you have a whole bunch of kids still running up and down the thing. It can become very challenging. That transfer platform is 14 by 24, and you can see here's somebody that's just laid a piece of cardboard, they've measured out and cut, and they use that for their transfer steps. It's a 14 by 24 inch minimum wide, 11 to 18 above the floor ground surface is what the height requirement would be. And along that 24-inch side, it has to be free and unobstructed so that you could transfer onto it. Going a little bit deeper, that transfer step is 14 by 24, the same minimum size as a transfer step. I think a little bigger is better always, but you have a 24-inch minimum accessible route for transfer that is 14 inches deep on every stair. Now, we got a question that says, can my transfer steps be deeper than 14? Yes, they can. Those are minimums. Sometimes you'll have to scoot quite a ways before you get another step. Anytime you're doing the maximum height of 8 inches, I think it can be a little bit more challenging for a younger population. So 8 inches might not be ideal for who you're trying to serve. If it's a really young group, maybe minimize that to 4 inches and make it so you can scoot a little bit farther before you have to do another one. I'm moving on to slide number 68. It says that there has to be a means to support transfer. It doesn't tell what you could be. Think about how you're transferring. The young person on the right is using a vertical pole that they're trying to push up on. That's a hard one to do. Okay, coming straight forward on a vertical pole. The ones with the loop can be better because when you think about pushing up with your hand, think about pushing up on a pole or pushing up on a flat surface, more like a grab bar or handrail. Wouldn't that grab bar or handrail be way better? I've seen where there's just a hole in a panel. I've seen where it's a rope loop. Um, I've seen all different kinds, what they're considering transfer supports. Listen, think about how you would get off a mobility device, sit next to that unobstructed 24-inch side, and how you'd think about coming out of a mobility device and what would you want and where it need to be to use it. And then up the transfer steps, what level? It doesn't require the handrails to be down at a lower level, but imagine if you had something besides the step that was similar to the transfer system that's in a pool or something where it's 4 inches above the nosing surface where you could still use it to kind of scoot yourself up. I think it could provide greater access. Here it shows that 11 to 18 inches onto that transfer platform with a clear floor space adjacent to the clear side. I'm moving on to slide 70, and it talks about that transfer system design. Imagine transferring, leaving your mobility device over here at that step, and you bump down, and so you know you're over there at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so think about how you can place where people are leaving their mobility devices and where they're exiting from the accessible elevated play components, and try minimize that distance of travel back to your device. In the elevated play component requirements, we say an elevated play component can be used to connect other elevated play components. Okay, think about how this is done though. A cargo net going across doesn't always, facilitate great access. This tube could be considered an elevated play component, but also part of the accessible route. Okay, so an elevated play component can be part of your elevated accessible route. At those accessible play components, you have to provide clear floor or ground space. We're talking about entry pointer seats at the ground level, and play tables and reach range requirements are also advisory in the standards. Moving on to slide number 73, I can't stress how important it is to have more than the minimum, surfaces that meet more than the minimum. It's so important to include opportunities. I shared with you, I use a manual chair. I had young kids. It was a long time ago, is when we were doing this rule. But what I found out very early on was I'd travel a long ways just to get to a play area that I could participate what they were doing with. Okay. We would travel about 15 miles in the car, load everybody up just to go to the playground, because I knew I could get around that one. If they fell, I wanted to participate and I wanted to play with them. Instead of sitting over by a bench on the other side of a railroad tie or near somewhere that I couldn't even get near them. And so children, young people with disabilities, and parents with disabilities, grandparents with disabilities, are looking for accessible environments to socialize, to learn, to play, to interact. We know more now that more than ever how important it is, the outdoor spaces that we get, the outdoor public spaces. If a young person that uses a mobility device on a daily basis doesn't have an accessible play area, it means you're out in the street, right? Unless you've got your own at your house, because your neighbor's not going to have an accessible play area. So if you don't have one in your community, where do you go? You go to the school, right? Because that's the best opportunity next. At least they've got a big hard surface where somebody's not going to try to drive you over. That's your next chance. So all I'm saying is that this is such an important feature to make sure that everybody gets to come and play or participate in your community, in your environment. And whether you're exempted or not, it could be a real big statement on inclusion. Okay, moving on to the minimum requirements for clear floor and ground space is similar to the built environment. It's a 30 by 48. It's discretionary placement, but really think about how somebody's going to transfer from their mobility device onto the element. Applies to ground level and elevated components accessed by a ramp. Those entry points and seats, I'm on slide 75, 11 to 24. I think somewhere in the middle, that transfer height people are used to, 70 to 19, right around 18 inches would probably be the best. Remember that young people mobility devices oftentimes sit up almost equal to adult wheelchairs, just because they want to be able to use a table or things like that. So transfer heights can be very similar. Moving into soft contained play structures on slide 76 is my section title, and water play components. We find these at a lot of Title IIIs, right? I'm on slide 77, and it's got a couple different pictures of these soft contained play structures. And the requirements are basically you get to the door, accessible route to the door. All bets are off once you get in. There's no transfer step requirement, minimum height, change in level requirements, opening requirements. There's nothing. Okay, nothing. You get in. If there's 3 or fewer entry points, you get 1. Okay, you'd get a transfer system into it. 4 or more, you get 2. Water play components are real popular. We're looking at ground level and elevated play components. And so if you have an elevated structure that has multiple elevated play components, a big boat out in the middle with all kinds of stuff on it, we would be looking at, based on the number of elevated play components, what type of access would be required, ramp or transfer. Okay. Look at the different things that you're providing, try to incorporate greater access. Understand that if you're doing this, a lot of times you're going to need to facilitate maybe greater access by an aquatic access wheelchair, so that somebody that is using a power device or a child that can't get their mobility device wet could still have an opportunity to participate. On slide number 79, I just wanted to highlight that we have a play area guide. We got a surface guide that I highlighted to you too. If you go through the play area guide and keep running to the bottom end of it, you run into our frequently asked questions. If you're dealing with an existing play area, I strongly urge you to read the FAQs, especially if you're doing an alteration. This webinar and others we've done on play surfaces and other issues around play areas, and the completed research that I talked to you earlier about on play surfacing. We also have guides, as many of you probably know, from chapters 1 through 6 on the ADA and ABA guidelines in a lot of different areas in chapter 10 too. At this time, we got some time to take questions from the audience. Thank you. We've been receiving a lot of great questions. And I guess first what I'd like to say is thank you to the interpreters for keeping up with me. I know I gave a lot of content in a short amount of time. I went through about 80 slides there, I think, in an hour. So thank you for keeping up with me. And at this time, I'm going to answer some of the questions that were pre-submitted and then also those that have been coming in throughout this live webinar. And thank you for sticking with me throughout this. As I said early on, I really believe that this facility type is one of the most important to make sure you get it right. It's so important to get it right because it's such an inclusionary thing, like we talked about throughout that webinar, about how, as me, a parent with a disability, the opportunity to participate and play with and be a part of what's going on at the playground. And for many people, that is the one space in their community that they might have that type of freedom, an accessible play area. And it might be at their school, it might be in their community, but so important of an area to make sure that's accessible. And with that, I said right before we came on here to the Q&A part about the references that we have on the Access Board's website. So we have that play area guide. And one of the first questions that we received as a pre-submitted questions was about how do I get more information so that I could evaluate a existing play area now? Or I think it's real important that when you're looking at product information and they're giving you a certain number of play components and defining which is accessible and not, and that's going to be a real important part, to understand what the manufacturer is calling their accessible play components and what not when you're buying a large composite play structure. So it's so important to understand that, but it's also important to know on your existing play areas, if you're managing or running or the person in your community that's over this type of facility, that you look at the adachecklist.org. And the Northeast ADA Center has a great resource there where you can get a checklist for a lot of different recreation facilities, including the built environment, where it gives you that opportunity to not only learn about those provisions, but also use it to evaluate those existing facilities through yourself or volunteers or however you can get it done. But then the Access Board has the play area guide. And in our play area guide, we have an opportunity to have a short evaluation, like it talks you step by step through a play area and kind of gives you that evaluation tool to evaluate that existing play area. What I also like is that we have our play area, our guide on surface material that we highlighted throughout this presentation as 7 things every playground owner should know about their playground surface, which we'll talk about more on upcoming questions, a great resource for understanding or guiding you through that surface process. Then we also have frequently asked questions. And as I shared with you, through the alteration process, it's important to understand some of those triggers of what's required in that alteration process. And we go through several different scenarios on those frequently asked questions that can be of great assistance. And I'm going to go through a few of those today during this question and answer time period. So there's those resources, but I also wanted to say that after the frequently asked questions, we have what we call a provisional index. And the provisional index, I use it. I mean, I still have to go to it because so oftentimes I forget a provision like in 206 on accessible routes. And that was the key I should have been looking at from the first point, because there's not only the scoping in 240 that we talked about, but the accessible route requirements in 206, and then the technical requirements that we went through in chapter 10. And sometimes you can get lost in where everything is. And so the unique thing, and that I worked on very hard with a former colleague of mine, Paul Beatty, to develop what we call provisional indexes for each of the recreation facilities. And so at the very end, after frequently asked questions, I believe, is this provisional index where you can look up the specific subject you're trying to, and it'll tell you where those provisions are. Okay. Very similar to what we get now, though. The access boards updated our website, and when you go to the standards, you have links to those references in the standard, so you don't have to try scroll through the document. You could just jump through the links, which is another really key opportunity to wayfind through the document faster and easier. We had a lot of really good questions come in, and a lot of them surround surface materials. And what's the best surface? Or how do I know my surface is accessible? Or how is my surface supposed to be maintained or installed? To talk about that, I tried to tell you about the reference standards, and the standards and really some of their limitations is that currently under the surface requirements, all we have is a lab test. And as everybody knows, surface materials that are left outdoors for years either decompose or their characteristics change, right? Over the freeze and thaw or the really severe heat or really severe cold, things change, right? And so we want to make sure that playground surfaces always meet the needs for safety and for accessibility. But typically what happens is that if someone's coming to investigate a playground, it's because of a safety issue, right? Somebody's fallen. And then accessibility typically gets drawn into it, unless it's like a transition plan where communities are evaluating their existing facilities. So it's so important that when you're purchasing a surface that you understand the life of the product that you're buying in your environment, because climates that are in the northern part of the United States versus the southern part, or in the desert Southwest, or where it's really wet and moderate in the Northwest, each one of these climates change the characteristics in a different way, right? And so it's so important to not only understand the characteristics you're trying to deal with, but also the population you're dealing with on your surface. How many people are out there a day? Is this an elementary school where you have K through 6 and hundreds of kids are out there from morning till afternoon? Or is it a local park where you get some participation, but it's not really overwhelming? So you can see that by evaluating the needs of your environment can help shape what your choices really are from the products that are available. And the last characteristic is really, can I maintain what I got? If it's going to be a loose fill product, is my maintenance staff, or is my janitorial staff, or is the park and recreation staff going to be able to keep up with the population we're trying to serve and how this surface reacts in our environment over time? And do they have the knowledge? Have they been trained and understand what they need to do? All of those characteristics are what you need to consider, as well as where am I getting the surface from, and what is the warranties, and will they test it upon installation, and will they come back and test it periodically to make sure it's still safe and it's still accessible, so that I know that I'm providing a surface that's compliant with what the standard's requiring. And so what is that commitment? So oftentimes I hear of people getting into agreements for surface materials that are very, very expensive, right? It can be a very large percentage of what the playground total cost could be. It could be 2/3 of the cost of your playground. So this is a very important purchase, as well as the equipment that's there. But first of all, we have to address that surface material, and can we actually understand what's going to work best for us? And then can we afford it? And then can we maintain it? And that's what the guide that we've tried to develop over a longitudinal study tried to help you understand is, can I use it? Can I afford it? Is it something I can maintain? If you're going to get a surface, I think it's important that you make sure that you have the documentation to show that your surface is accessible at all times. So when you buy a new surface, you make sure that that person that you bought it from gives you a certificate that shows that this surface complied with ASTM F1292 and ASTM F1951, right? Those are the two that I have to know for sure that the surface is passed. The 1951 is the wheelchair maneuverability test. So we want to have a certificate that shows it passed at least in the lab, but hopefully in the field after it's been installed. And then the ASTM F1292 is the fall attenuation test, which should be done at your site in the locations where children could fall that are within the use zone. And they should be able to show you with those certificates that you passed that evaluation. I can't stress upon you enough that having the documentation and understanding what your surface can and cannot do for the length of time it can do it, and how do we evaluate it and maintain it, is where you need to begin. Okay, so let's move on to how does the path of travel apply to play areas? Remember, the standard requires primary function areas that are altered to put a portion of that alteration cost towards getting someone to that altered area. We call that path of travel. The standard requires 20% of that alteration cost be used to get somebody to that now altered primary function area. Now, it could be arguable in a school whether a play area is the primary function area. But in a park, in a community setting, most people come to that park for the play area. It is a primary function area. Why I say there may be some issues that you'd want to talk to the Department of Justice about at a school is whether or not they would consider this a primary function area, as the real primary function area of that school may be the classroom, the learning. Okay, so check with DOJ if you have questions about specific application of the standard, and that holds true to the issues that were being brought up about homeowners associations and other private clubs where there's exceptions for religious organizations as well from requirement with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in this case, the play area requirements. And that is true. There are exceptions that do not require accessibility. So in that case as well, it's important to talk with the Department of Justice. And throughout the presentation, I gave their phone number. But they can also be reached at ada.gov for further information about the application of the standard to your specific facility types. There's a lot of times questions about specific play components and how they're counted. In my slideshow, I talked about a elevated tube, where I was saying that that elevated tube could be considered a play component as well as part of the accessible route. The standard permits that a play component can be used as an elevated accessible route. So that could have been a cargo net. It could be this crawl tube. There's no minimum height requirement or minimum width on a play component, but it could be used as an elevated play component and part of the elevated accessible route. Nature play areas are becoming very popular, aren't they? The trees, the mounds, the big boulders, things like that are being seen more and more frequently. And the mound question is the challenge for most of the time. I think I shared with you throughout the presentation about how I think it's easier to probably scoot up a grass hill or maybe a one that's covered in synthetic sports turf, scoot up the hill backwards instead of actually going up individual steps at a time. And it may be for some, it may not be for some, but I would think that it would be very close to be considered equivalent. And that if you provided the same type of transfer platform that you would getting onto an elevated structure, a composite play structure, or an entry point or a seat, that it would allow someone, instead of getting down to the ground to exit their mobility device at their seat, basically, because most research shows that the height of a transfer really excludes many people once you get over a couple of inches. So it's very difficult for many to get from the ground to their chair instead of maybe something that's basically horizontal or lateral with their height of the seat of their chair. And so by providing this transfer platform and then scooting up the hill, you can see how that could facilitate greater access by someone using a mobility device. And so if it was just the mound alone, ground level, if it would be a ground level play component. If you were talking about putting several things up on top of the mound, then I think you're looking at more of a requirement to get onto the mound, because now you have what we would call a composite play structure. When you have a composite play structure, remember the requirements are either transfer or ramp based on the number of elevated play components provided on that structure. It's 50%. So if there's only one up there, I think you're still cool with just doing a transfer platform or even just the mound, because remember, only one would have to be accessible at 50%. So I think it's when you start getting several things up on the mound that you trigger this requirement for a route up there somehow. I like having a route up to the top. Sometimes it can be really challenging then if you've brought your mobility device up to the top, how when I exit at the bottom of the slide, do I get to my mobility device? Or can be challenging. You'd have to have more people to help get you through that change where your mobility device is. And I really talked about that too in the slide presentation, where we had an exit point off of an elevated structure, a slide back over to the transfer system. Look where these two are in relationship to each other if that slide is what you consider as accessible, and the distance someone would have to scoot across your ground surface material to get back to their mobility device, or go back to a place where they could transfer back up and onto that elevated structure. I think there's still confusion sometimes about if there's a device that more than one person can get on. Maybe it's a fire truck, or maybe it's a series of swings, but it's really a play component where there's more than one opportunity to get on. We would consider that just one, and you could consider each swing an individual play component. Where you had a fire truck, that would be where multiple kids could all be on it, but it would still be one play component. We get the question too about play houses, a lot of storefront type of things. Remember that requirement is one of each type would have to be accessible. So if you had a little town or something like that, I would say that at least one of them would have to be on this accessible route and facilitate access into it. And that's where the real challenge in the standard comes, because the standard requires an 80-inch vertical clearance to each ground level play component, remember, on that 60-inch route. And so how do I get in then to this miniature house to actually play? So that can be a real challenge. I've seen it done with a larger opening. I think 80 inches was excessive going into something like that, but that's where the standard fell, is that it's 80 inches going into it. That gets me back to the surface just for another comment. And in the surface material, I showed you several slides of play areas that had different surface material. I just want you to consider when you're doing different surface materials, and people ask us all the time about engineered wood fiber, and is engineered wood fiber accessible? But let me back up first to the accessible route requirement. Remember, the 60-inch accessible route has to connect those elements that are required to be accessible at ground level, and then the entry point or seats. Additionally, that transfer system or exit or entry points for any elevated or composite play structure. So you'd have to connect to all those, but once you've connected to those, the whole rest of the play area could be what sand or mud or dirt or grass, whatever you wanted it to be, as long as it wasn't in the use zone and required by other authorities to make sure that there was, a fall impact surface there. But that, for the most part, yes, you could mix several different surfaces or a couple different surfaces, one for the accessible route, which we see a lot where now people are using the synthetic sports turfs or the grass, synthetic grasses, or even using the rubber tiles or poured in place rubbers as the accessible routes or portions of the play area that are required to be accessible. But then areas that are not required to be accessible, they'll do sand or some other type of loose fill product typically. So I just want to say that I shared with you in there how important it is that access to the whole play area, if possible, is what we're really after, right? Because kids run and play tag or run and do all kinds of things on that surface, let alone just try to get to and from the one element they're trying to play with. And so I urge you to think about when you start mixing surfaces. I know most people do it for a cost issue, and that is a huge consideration. But I would encourage that a more inclusive play area would incorporate probably the same surface and an accessible surface throughout. Questions about if there's multiple play areas within the same community, how many need to be accessible? That would be a Department of Justice question. You'd really have to look at what program access under their regulations would require. Maybe looking through some of the Project Civic Access settlements that were done with similar sized communities. You could get some knowledge or understanding about what they've considered in the past is what I'd look for. A question about, let's see here, public schools under the same standards. Yes, remember, public schools would be under the same standards and required to comply with these minimums. Any new construction or alterations after March 15th of 2012 is what we'd be looking at. I want to just go back to surfacing real quick again and just say that I think one of the most important things you can do is probably get a community buy-in on the type of surface you're going to choose. Maybe put up some test beds, maybe give the community a chance to say what's going to work best for them, and give different persons of all abilities a chance to weigh in on what type of products you're going to put in the play area and what type of surface material is going to be there and how best to be inclusive with those types of surface. Don't forget about that route to the play area though, okay? And don't forget about that you can't border your play area. And if you do border your play area, you would have to have a compliant ramp. And so outside the play area, remember, you can go up 30 inches or have a 30-foot ramp. Inside the play area, I can only go a 12-inch vertical rise in any ramp run before a level landing. So at the top and bottom of every ramp run, you have to have a level landing of 5 feet. So if I'm ramping up over, say, a border that I'm using to contain a loose fill product, I'm ramping up into it from my site arrival point. I have to ramp up with a compliant ramp. Now, remember, anything less than 6 inches, you could use a ramp with edge protection or flares and not have to have handrails. But anything over 6-inch ramp in, you would have handrails on both sides. You'd have a level landing of at least 5 feet for the width of your ramp. And then you would ramp back down into your play surface. Remember, no change in level greater than a 1/2 inch. That can be a real challenge if you're doing some type of a border that surrounds your play area. Loose fill products are typically harder to push in. Harder for large mobility devices or heavy mobility devices to turn around in. I think they're easier for scooters. Has been my usage. It's easier for me to get across on a scooter than it was in my manual chair. But power wheelchairs with a very narrow wheelbase and very thin tires, turning around could be very challenging in any loose fill product. People wanted to have a clarification of the area of sport activity versus a play area. The area of sport activity, remember, is a ball field. It's an area where the practice or playing of a sport occurs. We would think of it as ball fields, tennis, soccer, football, baseball. It could be horseshoes. It could be maybe an obstacle course, a challenge course, something like that could all be considered an area of sport activity. Whereas in a play area, we're looking for those minimum requirement for play components. Remember, we're trying to identify play components. I've had questions about gymnasiums where they have lots of different equipment. Would that be considered play components in there? No, we wouldn't consider. We'd consider that area an area of sport activity. It might be many areas of sport activity all within the one same gymnasium. But the requirement for areas of sport activity is a route to the boundary. Whereas in a play area, remember, we're still trying to connect elements and play components in that space required to be accessible. And the width of the route now is 60 inches instead of just 36 inches there. There were several questions about alterations and about doing an alteration. I think, first of all, go back to the definition of an alteration and understand that it's really affecting usability. And so if you're affecting the usability, yes, it could trigger or be considered an alteration and not maintenance. And so we also have several different alteration questions in the Access Board's frequently asked questions. And in that, we talk about what you touch, you fix. And so one of the questions in that one is, if in an alteration is being made to part of the play area, does the entire play area need to be upgraded with inaccessible components and surfacing? And typically, no. Generally, only those areas that are being altered must comply with the standards, unless the path of travel we talked about was triggered, okay, which could get you additional obligations to get into the play area or from that path of travel. Another one was, if a play surface is being replaced with an accessible surface and an existing playground ground level play components are not accessible, do the components need to be replaced? And the answer here we give is no. The rule of thumb is what you touch is brought into compliance. If the alteration to the play area only involves the surfacing, only the surfacing along accessible routes, clear floor or ground spaces, and maneuvering spaces would be required to comply. Okay, so moving on to another one, it talks about where an existing ground level play component is replaced, should the new component comply with the technical specifications in 1008.4, even if there's not an accessible route to it? It should, unless the required number of accessible ground level play components are already provided. The new play component would be required to be accessible. So if you currently have one of each type and you're adding another, and you don't have to have an additional, remember that earlier matrix I showed you that talked about additional ground levels and types. If you meet all those, remember, you can add something to the play area and not be required to do anything with that one you're adding. Are new play components added to an existing play area required to comply with the standards, even if there's not an accessible route from the parking or street to the play area? Yes. Okay, where new play components are added to an existing play area, the new play components are required to comply with the standards. Again, unless you've already got the number that are required to comply. Okay, it's anticipated that many play areas will be updated and altered in phases through a series of alterations. Additional access to the total play area and accessible routes from parking and street should be additionally added. We had another question here about topping off. Does topping off a play surface require replacement with an accessible surface? No. Early on, we talked about the difference between maintenance and an alteration. And this just topping off an existing surface material to bring it back into where it was because it's displaced. And I think that's the one real challenge, right? With a lot of soft or loose fill products, they get displaced, and they get displaced where it's an exit point for a slide or a swing, things like that. And that gets to be part of the real challenge. I know that when you watch kids in a playground, they're kicking it, right? The surface material, they're throwing it, they're doing whatever they can with it. And so now imagine trying to keep that accessible route through that surface at all times so anybody could use it who needs it. And you can see that large populations of young people going through that surface material is going to take daily raking to maintain a loose fill product to those accessible play components. And that's why people start mixing surfaces, right? That's why people start putting in the harder surfaces or the unitary rubbers or the tiles or the synthetic surfaces to those accessible ones, because then the maintenance has dropped significantly by doing something like that. And it gets challenging, right, to maintain those surfaces when you're doing loose fill products only. Let's look at a couple others here. We wanted more, or another question came in about no rise greater than 12 inches. Correct. We've talked about that one a couple times now. That means that the vertical rise can be no greater than 12 inside the play area. So you can still, or sometimes required to provide a ramp to those elevated play components, especially when there's, remember, 20 or more. You'd have to provide a ramp to a quarter of your elevated play components. And the ramp going up can only go up 12 vertical inches, okay, or run out 12 feet. Remember, it's 1 to 12. So you would have this ramp that could go up for 12 inches of vertical rise, come to a level landing. The landing would be 5 feet in the direction of travel, or 5 by 5 if he was changing direction. And then you could go up another 12 inches or whatever portion you wanted to go higher. But the maximum rise within a play area for a ramp is 12 inches. Let's see. There is no requirement for an elevated play component that's connecting to another elevated play component to have a ramp requirement. Okay, so there's no requirement for that crawl tube or things like that to maintain the maximum slope. I think I'll go into one last one here real quickly, and that was water play components. And that question was about the accessible route requirement in water play components. And remember, there's exceptions from the ground surface and the running and cross slopes for that accessible route when you're connecting water play components. Okay, that's all the time we have questions for, so we'll move on from here. Okay, moving on now. We need to get moving. We're on slide number 81. I wanted to leave everybody with the Access Board's contact information. The Access Board runs a technical information hotline phone number where you can reach a live specialist, or guess what? You can leave us a voicemail. We even take voicemail. We work very hard to try to get your calls back as soon as possible. Sometimes it might be the next day, but we will try to get a call back to you as soon as possible. You can leave us that voicemail 24/7, 365 at 800-872-2253. That's our voice line. Our TTY is 800-993-2822. We also provide technical assistance through an email at TA, stands for technical assistance, at access-board.gov. Additionally, a lot of the resources that I talked to you about are available at the Access Board's website, including animations on many different topics, discussions on all the Access Board's different rulemaking. And if you're not currently signed up, sign up for our news alerts right from our homepage at www.access, the mid-letter horizontal line, board, BOARD.gov. Moving on to slide number 82, and I'll turn it over to Robin.
Thank you, Bill. And this session is registered for AIA credit as well as ICC credit. The information is provided on this slide. This is GL 2021-0506 course number, and we will be reporting this to AIA, your attendance. ICC is a self-reporting. Next slide, please. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. You will receive a email at the conclusion of today's session with the evaluation, and we really strongly encourage you to give us your feedback about today's session. It will also give you information about how to go about obtaining your certificate of attendance for today's session as well. Our next session is on June 3rd, and it will discuss assembly areas. Registration is currently available at www.accessibilityonline.org. If you have questions regarding the session or having difficulty with registration or any technical issues, please call us at 877-232-1990, and our staff is more than happy to assist you with the registration process. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Bill, for the presentation, and that concludes today's session. This concludes today's session. You can now sign out by closing your browser and or using the leave option in the lower right-hand corner. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, interpreters. Thank you, captioner. Thank you, Great Lakes staff.
Thanks, Bill.